taking Winstrol orally, and what he means by that is under the tongue. They're using the liquid form because there's also pills, in tabs form. But this one is actually talking about the liquid form. But instead of injecting it, they're putting it under the tongue, which tastes horrible, by the way. Which way is preferable based on your experience? Is it better to do it orally as far as a liquid, number one, than injecting it? And then after that, do you think that the pills are just as good as the, as a separate part of the question than the injectable?
Well,
what do you think?
Injectable is better in the sense that it bypasses what we call the first pass of the liver,
Okay.
Which can change Winstrol into other metabolites that may not be as beneficial for you. So the idea of an injection is that you're definitely getting inside the system, you're bypassing the typical method, and it's going to be floating around. It could hit cells before it's been jiggered in any way by the GI system.
I see.
The idea of using, I guess what they're referring to as a suspension, which is what Winstrol is. It comes in an aqueous suspension as an oral, is perfectly fine.
Yeah?
You said it tastes terrible.
Oh, yeah.
Well, then that would be the drawback, except, counter to that would be, using a suspension, you'd probably have to use a much larger bore needle. So, you probably...
Why is it just as good?
Well, just as good meaning...
or efficient, or...
Well, it's not just as good as what I just described, or per what I just described, because you're going through that first pass of the liver. But what I meant to say, it's just as good as using a tablet, is what I should have said first.
Oh, so, okay.
Injectable is definitely far better than
I see.
oral. Okay, that's a for sure. But you've got to within the half-life of Winstrol, you're going to have to inject fairly frequently.
It's every other day, right?
Pretty much every other day, at least. And again, you'd probably have to use a fairly large bore needle. So that would be a serious consideration and a drawback to just using oral Winstrol. The problem with Winstrol, I don't know if I answered the question. So whether you use the, you're not injecting it underneath the tongue, but
no, you
use the Winstrol suspension under the tongue.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if it would go through sublingual. I'd have to research that for you to see if the molecule could pass through sublingually or not. It might just, be a way of, again, getting it in your mouth one way or the other into your GI. But the problem with Winstrol that we know is that Winstrol will cut your HDL, the so-called good cholesterol, in half within about 3 days.
Oh, wow.
Now, oh, wow is the usual response. As long as you know what the reason is when your HDL is cut, and here it is. In other words, not some strange pathology. It's because you're using Winstrol.
Yeah.
It's not so much to worry about. But I see this all the time with guys, and I can look at their lipid profile and go, okay, so you've been taking Winstrol, huh? And how'd you know? Because you'll see numbers like 8 and really low HDL because of it. And it usually takes about at least 90 days for it to bounce back. Now, whether you need to worry about cholesterol is a whole other discussion for another time. But that we know about Winstrol.
And what do you think the optimal? I mean, I've heard range-wise about anywhere between 50 milligrams every other day to 400 milligrams a week. Do you have any?
Well, again, this isn't something that Western medicine has studied.
Yeah.
I say Western medicine, United States medicine. Again, there are some Eastern Bloc countries that I'm sure have a lot more research than we have. Probably a lot of which isn't published, but they know a lot more about it. The only experience I have, again, is dealing with some of the patients that are forthcoming with me when they come for my assistance and say, hey, look, this is what I'm doing.
Yeah.
I've seen dosages ranging from as little as 50 milligrams injectable every other day, as you mentioned, to I think as much as 150 every other day. And I think it used to be utilized by women thinking that it was a so-called clean or very anabolic steroid. The problem is it's a DHT derivative, so I'm not sure if you're as safe as you think you are as a female using it in terms of trying to avoid side effects like acne, which is definitely enhanced by dihydrotestosterone. So Yeah, those are the dosages that I've heard being used right now.
But there's no need to do it every day. I mean, some people, although if you do the tabs, you may have to, because it's not as, obviously the tabs are not as strong as the injection also.
Well, I think the idea with using the injectable is you're not going to do it every day just because it's literally a pain in the ass.
It is.
But with a relatively short half-life of Winstrol, you can obviously match it better with the orals.
Yeah.
Much more easily than with the injectable. So I think that's why you see such a large dose being used by a lot of these guys when they're injecting, because
they don't want to do that.
They don't want to have to do it again as long as possible.
That was a good answer. Thanks, Doc. A person has a blood panel that shows elevated hematocrit. I don't know if I'm saying it right. You know what I mean. What should a person do about that? Is that temporary, or does that give any cause for concern over the long term?
Well, the elevation in hematocrit is probably definitely accompanied by an elevation in hemoglobin, and that can occur for at least two reasons. One is you might be training in your sleep, I call it. If you snore heavily or have frank sleep apnea, your oxygen saturation may be dropping low enough during your sleep where you're encouraging your body to make more of this hemoglobin hematocrit. Hemoglobin, you remember from high school biology, is what carries oxygen to the cells. And you and I can be talking here and my oxygen saturation may drop down to 95, and I'll stop and take a breath and recover my oxygen status in the blood. But I've seen sleep reports where there are guys dropping into the high 60s in terms of percentage saturation of oxygen before you see that obviously they woke up and took more breaths. Excuse me. And a lot of times the patients don't even remember they're waking up because you're in deep sleep. So you can go into oxygen debt way better while you're sleeping than when you're awake. And a lot of people say, well, hey, that's a good thing. I'm raising my hemoglobin, my oxygen carrying capacity, without even having to train. Isn't that good? No, it's not. The problem is, and I see this a lot, I've got some world champion, not just world-class boxers and some bicyclists that have their hemoglobin down in the even the upper 13s, one and another mid-16s, and they're doing just fine. You don't want to have hemoglobin hematocrit that high because the blood gets too thick. So that leads to the next part of the question. Is it dangerous? It is supposedly dangerous, meaning you'll read in the literature, I think once it gets to, depending on the book, 18.5 grams per deciliter of hemoglobin, it's an emergent situation. Well, there are people with polycythemia rubra, which is a disease that encourages their body to make this kind of hemoglobin and hematocrit all the time. They get into the 21, 22 levels without, I'm not going to say without incident. It's definitely not good for them and it's dangerous. But they're walking around between phlebotomies and they're doing okay, not great. So more than likely the average bodybuilder who may or may not snore is not at risk, but it's a good idea to go donate blood. The American Red Cross will take blood every 56 days. You want to make sure it doesn't get too high because they'll turn you away. They'll think you have maybe polycythemia rubra or some disease if you come in and it's too high. So it's best to maintain it both for them and for you. You donate blood, you're obviously doing somebody a favor. Your body, if for some reason you correct the situation, let's again assume it's because you're snoring heavily, meaning you're lowering your oxygen saturation at night. Every 3 to 4 months, those cells die anyway, and it will self-correct if you solve the problem. A lot of times, anytime you're using more than a replacement dose of testosterone, you'll see that effect without even going into oxygen debt during the night. In other words, if you're using 2 cc's of testosterone cypionate a week, it may go up on its own just from the leverage of the use of testosterone. And I hope he doesn't mind my saying this. A good friend of mine, Jerry Brainham, who you may recall from the days of Iron Man for One magazine, he used to write for. He sent me just the other day a new study showing that elevated levels of dihydrotestosterone have been associated with erythropoietin, so which would raise the H&H, the hemoglobin hematocrit. So obviously, if you have excess testosterone, you're doing twice as much as you should be. and you've got something that converts to dihydrotestosterone, that could be the mechanism by which we're raising the hemoglobin hematocrit. So let's see, we addressed how it could happen, if it's dangerous, and if it will resolve itself. Yes, again, and you can make it resolve itself by donating blood, and keep an eye on that. And there's plenty of ways to cure snoring, by the way. Just quick side note. They make these pieces that fit in your mouth that'll bring your jaw forward so that when you're supine, it pulls the soft tissue away from the trachea. Remember the old, we used to use them for wrestling and football, the things you drop in, they're rubber or plastic, and you put them in hot water for 15 seconds or whatever, and they form fit to your mouth. Well, they're made with adjustments, little holes, so that you can bring your jaw forward, again, pulling the tissue away, and that might be all you need to avoid the snoring at night. Anyway. Well, I see it all the time.
Yeah.
I see these athletes,
Yep.
big athletes, and even you don't have to be a big athlete. As we age,
Mm-hmm.
we're living long enough now where it's just the neck gets thicker, and I think it's over 16.5-inch neck. You might, you're a good candidate for having a snoring issue. So anyway, fun fact.
Yeah. Thanks, Doc.